Dear students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Now today in this module, we will be discussing about the biogeochemical cycles. Now what are biogeochemical cycles? These are pathways that are essential for cycling of elements between the abiotic and biotic factors of an ecosystem. Now just like an energy flow, these element cycling is also essential for proper functioning of an ecosystem. The biogeochemical cycles consists of two components, one a reservoir and the other one is an exchange pool. Reservoir is generally large and it works very slowly, while the exchange pool is very small but it is very active. Now with this introduction, now let us look into the learning objectives of the module. The learning objectives of this module would be to understand the concept of biogeochemical cycles, to inform or make the reader understand about the various elemental cycles that exist in nature. We will also discuss the effect and feedbacks of the different geochemical cycles, and we will also see how these cycles are impacted by the human behavior or the anthropogenic activities. Now, as I told you, biogeochemical cycles describe the pathway through which the essential elements cycle from the biotic and the abiotic components of a system and vice versa. For an ecosystem to exist, you need a proper and a continuous cycling of elements. Now, every geochemical cycle or every biogeochemical cycle possess two components, namely the reservoir and an exchange pool. Now, the reservoir, as I told you, they are abiotic in nature and they are very large, but they are very slow moving. I mean the process which occurs in this reservoir will be very slow. The other one is the exchange pool, which is very small, but they are very active in terms of exchange between the biotic and the abiotic components. The elemental cycles parallel to the energy flow and they differ in the abiotic factor. Now, energy flow cycle are generally solar driven, while the elemental cycle is highly conservative and the chemical elements are obtained from the small pool and retained within the system. Now, biogeochemical cycles are generally characterized into two types. One is the gaseous biogeochemical cycles and the other one is sedimentary biogeochemical cycles. Generally, atmosphere remains the reservoir for the gaseous cycle and the earth crust remains the reservoir for the sedimentary cycle. Now, carbon, nitrogen and oxygen are examples of the gaseous biogeochemical cycles, and phosphorus and sulfur are examples of a sedimentary cycle. Now, sedimentary cycle generally consists of two phases. One would be a water phase and the other would be a soil or a sediment phase. The elements that gets weathered will be dissolved in the water phase and they will move into the biotic components and will again return back into the sediment phase. Unlike the sedimentary cycle, the movement is very rapid in a gaseous cycle as it involves atmosphere as a reservoir. Now, since the cycle involves the geological, biological and chemical component in the cycle, it is termed as a biogeochemical cycle. Now, let us discuss about each of the element cycles in detail. To begin with, we will talk about the carbon cycle. Now, as you all know, carbon cycle is one of the important atmospheric cycle. The cycle mainly portrays the circulation of carbon between the atmospheric gas carbon dioxide, assimilation of carbon as organic matter via photosynthesis and its subsequent release back into the atmosphere through the respiration process. Now, carbon is an important constituent of all life molecule. It is present in air as carbon dioxide, whose percentage is 0.03%, and as carbonates and bicarbonates or as molecular carbon dioxide, I mean the aqueous form in the surface and the groundwater. It is also present in certain minerals which are associated with magnesium and calcium as carbonates. Now, coal, lignite, petroleum and natural gas are the sources of carbon fixed due to high pressure and temperature deep below the earth's surface. The organic matter fixed as oil shale is termed as hydrocarbonaceous kerogen and it contributes a major portion of the fixed carbon. The figure shows the carbon cycle and it will show how the carbon is cycled between the abiotic and the biotic components. which we will discuss in detail. Now, carbon is an element that cannot be broken down or converted into simpler ones. The amount of carbon in the earth is generally fixed, but the dynamic nature of the earth moves it or cycles it from one form to other between the living and the non-living organisms. The carbon cycle occurs in a series of steps. It begins by fixing of carbon in the biological system through capture of solar energy via photosynthesis. Now, the plants utilize the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and fix them as carbon in their various plant parts. Now, carbon is gradually transferred from herbivores to carnivores and other life forms through the food chain. The animals, through the process of respiration, once again inhales oxygen and it will release carbon as carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. Now, the death of plants, herbivores, carnivores will again return the carbon back to the soil through the action of decomposers. Now, the decomposers are nothing but the bacteria and fungi, which will act on these dead material and convert the carbon that is stored in the plants and other animals back into the atmosphere. Now, microorganisms play a very crucial role in the carbon cycle because they mediate a number of biogeochemical reactions. They degrade the fixed organic carbon and later transform them through various biochemical reactions into fossil fuels such as coal, lignite, peat and petroleum. Majority of organic contaminants like the xenobiotics are generally degraded by microorganisms and they are released as carbon back to the soil. Now, carbon circulates with the ocean too, where the photosynthetic algae fixes the carbon dioxide and they produce biomass. The carbon dioxide gas from the atmosphere dissolves in the water to form a weak carbonic acid. Now, this further dissociates into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ions. The hydrogen ions will react with the minerals and will alter them, resulting in clay and other ions such as sodium, potassium and calcium. Now, corals is another way which precipitates the calcium and bicarbonates to form calcium carbonate. You all know coral is a marine organism which possesses this potential to precipitate calcium and bicarbonates. Now, calcium carbonate is stored in the sediments in the ocean floor as a reserve where the sediments are further metamorphosized in deep subduction zones and orogenic belts. Now, during these volcanic eruptions, a huge amount of carbon dioxide will be evolved from the mid-oceanic ridges and hot spot volcanoes. The metamorphosized calcium carbonate is a source of carbon dioxide that is released from the ocean. The released carbon dioxide will once again cycle back in 3 different routes. One dissolved in ocean water, some are bound as carbonate rocks and some will be bound as biomass. Now, to summarize the carbon cycle is very vital and carbon acts like a backbone of life on earth. It has a lot of sources and sinks. The speed of carbon movement from source to sink is not same all the time and it varies from sources. Carbon cycle is altered through various anthropogenic activities which leads to a great level of impact at the global level. Now, the impact caused by these anthropogenic activities are discussed in detail below. The impacts caused by the anthropogenic activities are: 1. When you burn the fossil fuels, they release a huge amount of carbon dioxide. Now, the trees that sequester carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, when you cut these trees as a part of deforestation, then the level of carbon dioxide automatically increases and it alters the CO2 level in the atmosphere. Thus, these man-made activities causes increase in temperature of the earth due to the greenhouse effect. The global warming results in the destruction of the earth due to sea level rise, floods, drought, increased temperature and the changing weather pattern. Now, let us discuss about the oxygen cycle. Just like carbon, oxygen is also an important element that plays a vital role in the environment. It is a highly reactive gas which turns to a bluish liquid at -183 degrees Celsius. Now, it circulates between the atmosphere and bound forms of oxygen, which is chemically or biologically bound, example water, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, organic matter and minerals. Now, the atmosphere is a huge reservoir of this free oxygen containing almost 21% of oxygen. Also, the biosphere has some free oxygen which is released by the living organisms by the process of photosynthesis. But a majority of oxygen is present in the lithosphere in the chemically bound form as silicates and oxides. Now, the lithosphere is considered to be the largest source of oxygen than the atmosphere. Now, this figure shows the oxygen cycle and it shows how oxygen is cycled between the biotic and the abiotic factors. The oxygen from the atmosphere is taken up by the living organisms through the process of respiration. During aerobic respiration, the oxygen combines with carbon and they release carbon dioxide, which is further used by plants in photosynthesis. The oxygen utilized in respiration is returned back to the atmosphere during the process of photosynthesis. Oxygen plays an important role in combustion of fossil fuels and methane, which results in release of carbon dioxide, oxides of sulfur and oxides of nitrogen. Now, inorganic substance and other minerals are also oxidized by oxygen. You all know oxygen is a very good oxidizing agent. The degradation and the decomposition of the dead organic matter and the waste generated from the living organisms too require oxygen. The aerobic bacteria involved in decomposition also requires oxygen for a proper degradation of waste material. This equation shows how a glucose molecule is oxidized to carbon dioxide and water, and methane how it is oxidized again to carbon dioxide and water. In an aquatic environment, oxygen supports the aquatic life in the dissolved form. You call it as a dissolved oxygen. The chemical weathering of materials results in release of oxygen present in the combined form in the lithosphere. An important aspect of the oxygen cycle is the generation of the stratospheric ozone. In this, the oxygen is broken down by UV radiations into free oxygen radical, which again combines with oxygen to form ozone in the stratosphere. Now, the stratospheric ozone protects the earth from harmful UV radiations by absorbing them. The oxygen cycle, as such, if you see, they are strongly tied with other biogeochemical cycles and they greatly influence the other cycles. Similar to other cycles, the oxygen cycle is also affected by the human activities. Now, what are they? One, increased burning of fossil fuel will result in decreased oxygen and it will also increase the emissions of carbon dioxide. Thereby, it will alter both the carbon as well as the oxygen cycle. Now, let us discuss about the nitrogen cycle. Just like carbon and oxygen, nitrogen is again the gaseous biogeochemical cycle. It is one important and it is most important and crucial biogeochemical cycle of the environment. Now, nitrogen is a key element in the living organism and is a major constituent of the organic molecule such as the amino acids, proteins, chlorophyll and nucleic acids. They are available in huge amount in the atmosphere. Almost 78% of air is composed of the molecular nitrogen. Although atmosphere contains 78% of molecular nitrogen, they are not directly available to the living beings due to their inertness and the non-reactive nature of the molecular nitrogen, because they have a triple bond between the nitrogen atoms. Though the molecular nitrogen gas is largely available in the atmosphere, it remains inaccessible to the living organisms, which I told you already. Only when the molecular nitrogen gas is converted into ammonia, it becomes accessible. So, soil and oceans, only when the molecular nitrogen gas is converted into ammonia, it becomes accessible. With respect to the nitrogen cycle, soil and oceans are the second major reservoir of nitrogen next to the atmosphere. Now, the biosphere constitutes just a minimum quantity of nitrogen. Almost 1 million times lesser nitrogen is present in the biosphere when compared to the atmosphere. Now, the nitrogen exists in both organic and inorganic forms and in different oxidation states like ammonia, nitrate, nitrite and so on. The nitrogen is highly interchangeable compound and hence it is very unstable. They undergo frequent transformations from one oxidation state to another according to the requirement or use of the organisms. Now, the transformation include nitrogen fixation, nitrification, denitrification and ammonification. which is carried out generally by the microorganisms, especially the bacteria and fungi. The molecular nitrogen is made biologically available through nitrogen fixation. The conversion process is very energy demanding and only few prokaryotes can convert molecular nitrogen into biological nitrogen. You might have heard about the nitrogen fixing bacteria, especially the rhizobium, which is present in the root nodules. Now, almost 8 electrons and 16 ATPs are required to break the triple bond which is present there in the dying nitrogen gas or the molecular nitrogen. Now, this can be done by lightning. Lightning can break this triple bond, and certain industrial process can also break the triple bond. Now, and convert it into biological available nitrogen. As I mentioned, nitrogen fixers are free living bacteria and they exist in symbiotic relationship with the host plant. Example, I told you rhizobium, which is present in the root nodules of the leguminous plant, can fix the nitrogen, molecular nitrogen. Cyanobacteria can also do that, which is generally present in the aquatic systems. The nitrogenase enzyme, which is present in the nitrogen fixers, catalyzes the reduction of molecular nitrogen to ammonia. The ammonia is further oxidized to nitrite and nitrate by the nitrifying bacteria through the process of nitrification. Within this, two distinct steps are involved in nitrification. One where the ammonia is oxidized to nitrite, and in the second step the nitrite is oxidized to nitrate. Now, when the ammonia is oxidized to nitrate, an intermediate hydroxylamine is formed, which is carried out by the ammonia oxidizing bacteria. The ammonia oxidizing bacteria are autotrophic and they generally involve two enzymes, one ammonia monooxygenase and hydroxylamine oxidoreductase. In the second step, where the oxidation of nitrite to nitrate is carried out, it is again carried out by a special group of bacteria like the nitrite oxidizing bacteria. Examples of nitrite oxidizing bacteria are Nitrospira, Nitrobacter, Nitrococcus and Nitrospina. Now, the nitrate that is formed is highly soluble in water and generally they get leached out into the water body. You all know nitrate, when it is soluble, it is easily carried out and it becomes a nutrient for the plants. Now, when there is excess of nitrate, then more amount of plants start growing and resulting in the problem called as eutrophication. The biological nitrogen is once again returned back to the atmosphere by the process of denitrification. Now, here denitrifying bacteria will convert the nitrate to dinitrogen gas under aerobic condition with a series of intermediates such as NO2, NO and N2O. Now, denitrification is carried out by the anaerobic bacteria in soils, sediments, lakes and oceans. Now, these denitrifying bacteria are chemoorganotrophs and they require carbon for its growth. Examples of them are Bacillus, Paracoccus and Pseudomonas. Now, plants take up nitrogen as ammonia and nitrate ion from the soil mixture. Ammonia is generally toxic at higher concentration and generally plants prefer ammonia in lesser level. The nitrogen enters into the animals and other trophic levels via the food chain, which we already studied in the carbon cycle. Similarly, when the plants fix the nitrogen, from plants it is transferred to herbivores when they consume the plants, and from herbivores it is transferred to the carnivores when the carnivores consume the herbivores. Once again, the same decomposers acts when the plant or animals die, and during the decay the decomposers like the bacteria and fungi, they will act on this and they will result or convert the nitrogen into inorganic nitrogen via the decomposition process. The process by which the decomposers convert the ammonia into ammonium ions is generally called as or termed as ammonification. Bacteria, actinomycetes and fungi generally play a role as decomposers, which we have already discussed. The ammonia is then available for plants and other microorganisms for their growth. So, whatever we discussed in the nitrogen cycle, it is clearly shown in this figure, where you can see the different process, how the nitrogen is being, the molecular nitrogen is being fixed by the certain nitrogen fixers like rhizobium, lightning and other industrial process, and how it is fixed. then how ammonia is oxidized to nitrite and nitrate, and by the process of denitrification how nitrite is converted back to molecular nitrogen with the formation of intermediates. So, here again it is clear how the gaseous nitrogen exchanges itself between the abiotic and the biotic component of an ecosystem. Now, let us discuss how the anthropogenic activities disturb the nitrogen cycle. 1. The N2O, which is produced as an intermediate during the denitrification process, is a greenhouse gas. They possess a great global warming potential when compared to methane and carbon dioxide. The N2O warms the atmosphere and it generally leads to depletion of the stratospheric ozone. Now, combustion of fuel at high temperature, they generally release huge amount of NO to the atmosphere, which later gets converted into NO2 and HNO3 in the atmosphere. Now, HNO3, you all know that it is a major constituent of the acid rain and it causes a lot of environmental and health effects, like it increases the pH of your water body, it affects the marbles and all those things. So, the nitrate again, which is readily soluble in water, it leaches out and mixes with the water bodies, and excess use of nitrate in fertilizers again contaminate the ground and surface water, and it affects or causes the methemoglobin anemia disease. Also, it leads to eutrophication in the water bodies. When you do deforestation, again it alters the overall nitrogen cycle. Now, these are the different anthropogenic activities that disturbs the nitrogen cycle. Now, let us discuss about the sedimentary cycles. The phosphorus is an example of a sedimentary cycle. It is an element that is present in earth in the form of water, soil and sediments. They are not present in the atmosphere and hence lacks an atmosphere component in the cycle, making the cycle endogenic. Now, the availability of phosphorus in soil is very limited, and this is the reason for application of phosphate fertilizers to enhance the plant growth. Now, animals and humans obtain the phosphorus through the food chain from plants and plant eating animals. Phosphorus is an essential nutrient for animals and plants. It is a major constituent of protoplasm and DNA, which plays a major role in cell development and the energy storage. Now, ATP, that is from where your body takes up energy during the breakdown of ATP. Now, let us discuss about how the phosphorus is cycled. The biogeochemical cycling of phosphorus occurs, or it occurs between the living and the non-living element of the earth. The phosphorus is a limited nutrient which is found in nature in terms of orthophosphates. Its limitedness in the environment makes the cycle very crucial. Unlike the carbon, the reservoir for phosphorus is rocks, where the deposition occurs through ages. They are found especially as minerals associated with rocks. Hydroxyapatite, a calcium phosphate, is a major reservoir of phosphate in the soil. Now, over the period of time, the geological process causes weathering and erosion of rocks, thereby the phosphate ions which is stored in the rock as minerals will be released into the soil and the water bodies. Now, most of the phosphorus is lost to the sea, where it gets deposited in the deep sediments. The marine organisms once again picks up the phosphorus which is there in the sediments, and they will reintroduce them back into the cycle. Now, cycling of phosphorus from sea to land is comparatively very slow due to the loss of fish and other marine creatures for food and industrial process. The phosphorus also enters through plant by absorption of phosphate ions from the soil, and once again it enters into the food chain through the animals. After the consumption, the phosphate is generally assimilated, or it is converted into ATP, nucleotides and other organic molecules. Now, phosphorus are generally stored in bones and in biological membranes in the form of phospholipids. After the death of the plants and animals, these phosphates are once again returned back to the environment by the action of these decomposers, the bacteria and fungi. The organic form of phosphates within the soil are provided to the plants through this bacteria on decomposition. The process by which the organic phosphorus is converted into the inorganic forms of phosphorus through the action of decomposers is called as mineralization. The movement of phosphorus between the living being and the environment is generally uneven due to certain reasons. Now, what are those reasons? One, the phosphorus gets locked up in the bones of organisms, organic detritus and inorganic particles of the sediment. They are taken in lakes. The lakes take up phosphorus at a much faster rate, but it releases them at a very slow rate. These are the two reasons why there is unevenness between the phosphorus cycling. This is the reason why there is unevenness in the phosphorus cycle. Now, this figure shows how the phosphorus which is there in the rocks are weathered and they enter into the water cycle, and how it through the water it is taken up by plants, and from plants it enters into the animals through the food chain, and once again how it gets decomposed and then returns back into the soil. Now, let us discuss about the impacts that the anthropogenic activities cause on the phosphorus cycle. The cycling of phosphorus is very slow and they are retained in certain segments, but the human interference bring about changes in the cycle. Like one, during certain times the phosphorus available in the soil are locked and they are made unavailable, which we discussed earlier. Now, this results in excessive use of fertilizers, which again leads to more addition of phosphate into the soil and water through seepage. This is again one more reason for the eutrophication in water bodies. Now, the plants, once again if there is excess phosphate, they take, and the excess phosphates are then washed away, and it through the agricultural runoff, and it adds to the algal blooms or eutrophication. The second one is mining of apatite, that is the calcium phosphate. During this mining activity, what happens is that a large amount of phosphate is released from the rocks, which once again enters into the water body and into the soil. The third factor, anthropogenic activity, is the deforestation. Now, deforestation again reduces the availability of phosphorus in the soil. The fourth one is a discharge of sewage and other industrial effluents into the water bodies. For example, the industrial effluents and sewage has some amount of phosphorus as phosphates, and in addition to that you also have certain use of detergents, which are the main source of phosphorus. When they are used in excess, they are discharged into the through the sewage into the water bodies. Once again it adds to the phosphorus level in the soil and water, and once again it will lead to eutrophication. Now, let us discuss about the sulfur cycle. Now, sulfur cycle is again example of a sedimentary cycle. Now, sulfur is a yellow, odorless and a non-metallic element which is generally found in the earth's crust. It is an important constituent of protein and vitamin, and it plays an important role in protein and enzyme functioning in plants and animals. Sulfur is present naturally in the earth's crust, water body and atmosphere. They occur in the earth's crust in the form of gypsum, that is calcium sulphate, and pyrite. Now, oceans are the largest reservoir of sulfur. Around 2.6 gram per liter of sulfates are present in oceans, in addition to dissolved hydrogen sulfide gas and elemental sulfur. Atmosphere is another source of sulfur, because you know a lot of oxides of sulfur, that is sulfur dioxide, ammonium sulphate and sulphate particles, hydrogen sulfide gas, all these things are present in atmosphere. So, the biogeochemical cycle of sulfur generally consists of two major components, one the terrestrial and the other one atmospheric component. The sulfur cycles between air, water, soil and living organisms. Now, let us discuss that in detail. Now, the weathering of rocks releases sulfur, which is stored in the earth's crust. In addition to weathering, sulfur from the earth's crust is also released through volcanic eruptions. Now, sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide gas is released from the active volcanoes. The organic matter in marshes, tidal flats, bogs, wetlands also emits sulfur in the form of gaseous form, that is hydrogen sulfide. Sea spray, forest fires, dust storms are also another source of these sulfate salts in the atmosphere. Now, sulfur enters the atmosphere from the land through four routes, namely the volcanic activity, soil dust, industrial activity and sulfur reducing bacteria activity. Now, ocean acts as another major contributor of sulfur to the atmosphere. Now, the aerosols of seawater, deep sea hydrothermal vents and the dimethyl sulfide gas that is produced by the marine algae are the major routes of sulfur entry into the atmosphere. Now, in the atmosphere, the dimethyl sulfide droplets act as a nuclei to condense water in the clouds, thereby playing a major role in cloud cover and the climate change. Dimethyl sulfide is finally converted to sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere. The sulfur dioxide, when it comes in contact with air, gets oxidized to sulfur trioxide. Likewise, the hydrogen sulfide combines with oxygen to form sulfur dioxide and sulfur trioxide. Now, these oxides of sulfur once again will react with water droplets in the atmosphere to form droplets of sulfuric acid, which is again one of the major constituent of the acid rain. The ammonia that is present in the atmosphere will react with the sulfuric acid to form ammonium sulfate salts. The droplets of sulfuric acid and ammonium sulfate reaches the earth as acid deposition, which is harmful to the plants, animals and human beings. Also, it changes the soil pH and it acidifies the lake in addition to chemical weathering of buildings. This is what I discussed earlier regarding the effects of acid rain on various components. Now, the sulfur once again gets accumulated in the sediments of ocean, lakes and reservoirs. It also combines with iron to form ferrous sulfide and gives a black color to the ocean sediments. Now, sulfur is an important constituent of even the amino acids, especially the cysteine and methionine, which becomes a constituent of the proteins. Only few organisms can utilize this organic sulfur via amino acids. Rest assimilate sulfur in the inorganic form as sulfate ions. The plants will assimilate sulfate, and from them sulfur enters into animals via the food chain. Now, the death and decay once again releases the sulfur back to the environment. Bacteria reduces sulfur and obtains energy both in the presence as well as in the absence of oxygen and other terminal electron acceptors. Now, sulfate reducing bacteria are extremophils, which belongs to archaea domain. They live in the hydrothermal vents and hot springs. Now, sulfate reduction can be assimilatory as well as dissimilatory in nature. Now, sulfate is reduced to organic sulfhydryl group in assimilatory pathway, and desulfurization of sulfhydryl groups to hydrogen sulfide is the dissimilatory pathway. Now, the desulfuromonas is an example of a sulfate reducing bacteria that will reduce sulfur to hydrogen sulfide. Now, a special group of bacteria, the photosynthetic green and the purple sulfur bacteria and some chemolithotrophs oxidize the hydrogen sulfide to produce elemental sulfur. Now, let us look into the various impacts that are created by the anthropogenic activities on the sulfur cycle. Similar to all other biogeochemical cycles, the sulfur cycle is also altered by the human activities. One, through the burning of fossil fuels releases a lot of oxides of sulfur. 2, by refining petroleum products, it adds sulfur to the atmosphere. Purification of sulfur containing metallic ores also releases sulfur dioxide to the atmosphere. These are the 3 routes or ways by which human activities disturb the sulfur cycle. To summarize, at the end of this module, we have discussed about the importance of biogeochemical cycles in the earth. We have also discussed how these elements are important and they cycle between the biological, geological and chemical components of the environment, which is nothing but the abiotic and the biotic component of the ecosystem. Then we have looked into various cycles, the gaseous cycle, which is the carbon, oxygen and nitrogen cycle. Then we have also discussed about the sedimentary cycles, both phosphorus and sulfur. We have also discussed how these elements are important in both the components for proper functioning of an ecosystem. Lastly, we have discussed about how these anthropogenic activities alter or create an impact in the biogeochemical cycle, and which has resulted in a lot of burning global issues. I hope this module would have been of great help to you. Thank you.